Hi, everyone, and welcome back to AP US History. Today, we're going to be talking about the influence of revolutionary ideals, specifically during the Revolution and immediately thereafter. This has to do with the ideals that led to the Revolution continuing to be present in the US immediately thereafter. Here is the content summary for you. Go ahead and pause the video and copy that. The first thing we want to talk about in terms of the influence of revolutionary ideals has to do with increasing democracy and abolishing slavery. For a country that talked about liberty and the purpose of government being to protect one's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness or property, for a lot of Americans, the existence of slavery in a country that professed its liberty as the goal sort of conflicted with that ideal. Not for all, of course, because we still had lots of slavers. But abolition becomes more important in the years following the Revolution. In certain states, such as New Hampshire and Connecticut, enslaved individuals filed petitions to end slavery there. These were largely unsuccessful. In other places like Massachusetts, Paul and John Cuff were two brothers and free African Americans who, along with five other free Black Americans, filed a petition suggesting that they should not have to pay taxes. Since they were Black, they were not allowed to vote in Massachusetts. And they were thinking back to the revolutionary catchphrase, if you will, no taxation without representation. How could they pay taxes if they couldn't vote and therefore were not represented? This petition was also rejected. However, it did result in extending the vote to Black people in Massachusetts. So at least there was some good news out of that. Although Massachusetts would rather have you pay taxes than prevent you from voting. In other states, there were lawsuits to end slavery. In Massachusetts, again, specifically, the Constitution reads, all men are born free and equal. And several enslaved people in Massachusetts sued the government of Massachusetts in order to end slavery based on this statement in their Constitution. Many of these cases were decided in favor of the enslaved, therefore they were set free, thereby basically ending slavery in Massachusetts. Other states went after ending slavery in different ways. Vermont, which was not a state until 1791, in fact, it was a sovereign and independent entity until that point, in its original Constitution of 1777, abolished slavery. In Pennsylvania, there was a gradual abolition of slavery, which was basically instituted in 1780. Anyone born after March 1st of that year would be considered free after they reach the age of 28. So there's a little bit of a caveat there, but they are getting rid of slavery. Unfortunately, one invention by Eli Whitney reinvigorated the institution of slavery in the United States. Slavery, because of the influence of the ideals of the Revolution, was on its way out. But when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, cotton became too profitable for many slavers to want to end slavery. So they began resisting the end of slavery because of the profits available. This is all tied in with the Industrial Revolution and the development of the factory system, first in Britain, and in the 1790s, it's going to start coming to the US as well. All of these efforts at abolition were influenced by revolutionary ideals, but it's the cotton gin economics seems to win the day. We also see during the immediate post-revolutionary period an extension of political democracy within the various states. All of the state constitutions have some level of voting by their citizens, and different states have different levels. One example of a state that has a high level of democracy is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania in its 1776 Constitution, developed a unicameral legislature, that is a one-house legislature, so that everyone in the legislature was voted directly by the people of Pennsylvania. And they were the primary government of Pennsylvania. There was no governor. There were also no property qualifications for voting. So all male taxpayers in Pennsylvania could vote, which is a lot better than other states. Pennsylvania was one of the more democratic states at the time. There was no governor to stop the legislature. Basically, the legislature represented the will of the people without any checks on that power. The Constitution also provided for some level of education, at least at the elementary level. Education is necessary for democracy. A public that has a say needs to be informed about what they're voting on. So the Pennsylvania Constitution provided for some level of education at the elementary level. They were also able to get rid of the Penn family. Basically, the Penn family had owned Pennsylvania ever since it was granted to them by the king, to William Penn directly. And so his family continued to basically own Pennsylvania. They got rid of that in the new Constitution, so that way it was more democratic and not run by one family. However, many states temper democracy. That is, they reduce the level of democracy. John Adams, who famously defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, called for things like mixed government. And then gets this idea from Montesquieu. We talked about those Enlightenment thinkers. John Adams thinks that a government should be mixed and not be too democratic. There are a lot of early American leaders who are afraid of democracy. No state was quite as democratic as Pennsylvania, for example. In New York, there were still property qualifications in their 1777 Constitution. South Carolina had one of the most restrictive franchises. And just to get into some of the numbers here, the elite planters disqualified about 90% of the white male population from holding office by requiring the governor to have 10,000 pounds worth of debt-free property, the equivalent of $700,000 today. Senators to be worth 2,000 pounds, and assemblymen to own property valued at 1,000 pounds. Basically, unless you were wealthy, you couldn't serve in the government of South Carolina. There were also property qualifications for even voting. South Carolina had very little democracy compared to Pennsylvania. New York is somewhere in the middle. In the wake of the war, over 100,000 loyalists, those people who were loyal to the British Empire, left what would become the United States and left much of their property behind. Now, many patriots called for the redistribution of said property. And this is one of the reasons that the elites don't like the lower classes, the working classes, because they want the property of the people who left. Basically, we're looking at land redistribution. The leaders of the states at the time, however, were not in favor of land redistribution and ended up auctioning off all of this loyalist property to the highest bidder, with the result that people who were elite landowners before the revolution added to their land, and those of the middle and working classes did not gain a whole lot from the economies here, from the departure of loyalists and the seizure of their land. In fact, these newly enlarged elite estates, many of them, the owners of these new estates, are willing to invest in manufacturing. So it does spur on some domestic industry and begins to shift the economy away from as much agricultural produce and land-based things to more domestic industry. And this is right around the same time that the factory system is going to start to be introduced to the United States, and you're going to start to see the cotton gin. So really starting to stimulate domestic industry because of the enlargement of elite estates. Meanwhile, people moving west into places like the Ohio Valley, who would have initially been considered squatters, people who were claiming land laying a claim to land without legally having a claim to land, believed because of the way the government was being run that the government would protect their property claims. And a lot of people start moving into the Ohio Valley, start moving west, taking land away from the people who already live there and hoping the government will support their claims. We're going to look at the interactions between internal migrants and Native Americans a little bit later in this period. But it does lead to a lot of conflict. Meanwhile, in the planter class, the slavers were not in the war for liberty. They may have said that they were in the war for liberty, but they're only thinking of liberty for themselves. The main reason that the slavers in the planter class joined the war effort was to protect their property. And by property, they are referring to people. These slavers not only are against emancipation and abolition, but will violently resist it. And an ideology begins to develop where the planter class believes that it's responsible for ensuring that their enslaved population remains civil, quote unquote. Obedient is what they mean there. So what we're going to see coming up is these slavers are going to develop an ideology where they believe that slavery is a good thing. And I know that sounds a little crazy, but this is the ideology that they developed. And it's an ideology that still has after effects to this day. Now, let's talk about this idea of Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is something that often comes up on the exam, and is a really good example for, or a really good way to explain how women were treated during this time. Now, women during the war had contributed at a lot of levels. Okay. So women during the war effort had taken on a lot of roles. The Daughters of Liberty, for example, were the organizers of the various boycotts. Molly Pitcher, a name that she adopted, took her husband's place in battle when he fell, whereas Deborah Sampson dressed as a man so that she could fight in the war. Women took over the control of farms and businesses, essentially running households alone while men were off fighting in the war. So, women were doing a lot in the war effort. During the war, other women, such as Eliza Wilkinson, wrote historical accounts of the war, basically writing letters to provide as accurate a role as possible. But Eliza Wilkinson also writes about how, since she is writing about the war, she's out of her quote unquote sphere. This is still a time, not still a time. This is a time where the idea of separate spheres is beginning to sort of coalesce, is beginning to really firm up. And people like Eliza Wilkinson show that, even though she's doing work that's not normally gender coded for women, she has an awareness of that as well. Abigail Adams, who was the wife of John Adams, writes to him on various occasions and tells him to remember the ladies, quote unquote, as he is basically organizing the U.S. government. So, this is the context, and this is what's going on when this idea of Republican motherhood begins to germinate. This is a time where the idea that women's role has to do with the home, domestic life, and educating the family. So on the one hand, before we do that, women at this time were responsible for teaching the family Republican values. And by Republican, they meant Enlightenment ideas. Okay, don't think of modern politics. Think of things like no kings, small levels of political democracy, things like that. Some self-government. Okay. And this idea comes out of the egalitarianism where, there's greater equality. We're not talking about actual equality here because we still have slavery, but this is a time where their form of egalitarianism is we don't have nobles, we don't have privileged classes who are birthed into their privileged class, even though there's something to that. So if women are responsible for the education of the families, that sort of begins to relegate them to the home, relegates them to domestic concerns. Now, at the same time, women were still legally subordinate to men. They couldn't own property. They couldn't initiate lawsuits. They couldn't enter into contracts. And essentially, women were tied to the man, either their father or husband. Okay. Um, New Jersey is a little bit better in some ways. Some women could vote, for example, until 1807. If you weren't married, you could vote because only non-married women could own property. Married women's property would go to the husband. So, in some sense, we see some effort to not just include women in spreading, revolutionary ideals, but giving them a responsibility and taking part in this. But at the same time, women were still legally, socially, economically subordinate to men. Now, the American Revolution reverberates across the Atlantic and stimulates the other Atlantic revolutions. Part of the reason that France had its own revolution, now France had a lot of problems. It had many problems of its own. And really, all the American Revolution does is pushes it over the edge. Two things happen as a result of the American Revolution in France. One, since the French government was supportive of the American Revolution, they were basically trying to stick it to Britain. They, when soldiers come back to France, they come back with all these revolutionary ideas in their heads. These ideas, many of which originated in France, come back and start to like get a new life in France and start to spread, and not just within among the bourgeoisie, but among the lower classes as well. So when the French Revolution does happen, there's a lot of lower class people who are involved, and we don't talk about them as much because they're not the ones who are declaring things and writing stuff down. Other factors for the revolution include famine that's going on there. But the American Revolution's role has to do with the French government spending a lot of money to, again, stick it to Britain, helping out um, the American revolutionaries that they're having serious financial problems. And the whole reason that King Louis called the Estates General was to ask them if they were willing to be taxed because France had financial problems because they spent a bunch of money here. And when the revolution does happen, a lot of Americans are supportive of it because they're doing like us. But then it turns sour. And when the radical phase of the revolution, the second reign of terror begins, when they break out the, guillotines, a lot of Americans sort of don't want to associate that with that anymore. In Haiti, Toussaint Louverture leads the revolution there. Um, this is a revolution largely by enslaved peoples, but they are following many of the same ideas of the American Revolution. And Haiti was at the time a part of a French colony, part of France. And, when France goes into its revolution, Haiti follows suit. Other revolutions led by Simon Bolivar, all of them follow the same ideas, those same Enlightenment ideas. So the American Revolution really gets those Enlightenment ideas going, and the other ones pick up on a lot of that. It's all about the Enlightenment. So that'll do it for today. Go ahead and check OneNote for any further instructions.